Okay. You could text her in the chat. Okay. In the work chat. Saying she doesn't see it. Okay, no, she sees it. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll be getting started in about another minute or so. All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ariana Wells. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight for this very important discussion. Before we get into it, I just want to give you a little bit of a background on org and some of the work that we do here. So we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan group that's been around for about 10 years, and we work to build the principles of good governance in the Bahamas. Excuse me. And we do that in four separate ways. So we promote laws and policies that are transparent and are in the best interests of the people that they're actually meant to serve. We run community education and engagement initiatives to build the capacity of the people to take part in governance processes. We also do capacity building initiatives for nonprofit organizations so that we can help them to reach their strategic objectives. And we create tools that bridge the gap between citizen and government communication. So we're a small team that takes on a whole lot. And so often we do rely on external experts and subject matter experts like this star panel that you see here today to lead us through some very important discussions that you've been seeing happening in the media, specifically around VAT. And so we're hosting this panel tonight really as another further attempt to educate the people so that they can make meaningful contributions to society. And so, like I said, we have a star panel tonight. I'm so excited to learn more from each and every one of them. And I know you all are too, so I won't take up too much time in the introduction. But I would like to introduce you to our host for the evening, who is Rachel Knowles Scott. She is a journalist with the Nassau Guardian. So, Rachel, please take us into the evening.
Thank you, Ariana. So we'll get right into it. A lot of us know that VAT was implemented in January 2015. And ever since then, it's been over a decade. It's pretty much remained a pretty newsworthy topic since then. It takes its place on the front pages every time there's a rate increase, a slash, an exemption, etc. And so, over the past 12 years, just about 11 years, um, it's dominated national conversations about fiscal policy and responsibility. Um, a Bahamian who has concerns about the government's spending and fiscal priorities is still pretty likely to say or to pose that question as where the VAT money gone. And the impact of that on our revenue as a country has been undeniable. Just a quick overview of budget numbers for the past 12 years shows that revenue has more than doubled, with VAT in the last fiscal year ending 2025 making up roughly 40% of our total revenue. So in recent weeks, we've seen this emerge again after the Prime Minister announced plans to remove VAT entirely on uncooked foods beginning April 1st. What's emerged since then has been a widespread discussion about how impactful that's likely to be for the average Bahamian consumer, who many argue is still struggling with a cost of living crisis. And what's also kind of emerged is a reopening of old wounds, with back and forths in Parliament and elsewhere about which administration or political party is to blame, or so to speak, for VAT, because it is largely regarded in these sorts of spheres as a burden on Bahamian individuals, residents, businesses, etc. And so, with all that said, I think that's kind of the background that we're working with. We have a very diverse and experienced panel here tonight to give us all a better view about what VAT is as a tax, what impact it has in the Bahamas, from government, private sector, and individual standpoints. So I will now have our panelists introduce themselves, and we can start with Keisha Ellis, who is the outgoing Executive Director for Hands for Hunger.
Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm Keisha Ellis, the outgoing executive director at Hands for Hunger. I've been executive director for 6 years. So that is coming in right after Dorian and, of course, through COVID-19. So I've definitely had a whirlwind of experiences trying to get food to the most vulnerable people in our communities, and even people who are not chronically vulnerable or food insecure, but experience waves of food insecurity and the inability to feed themselves and their families. So I think I have a pretty good finger on the pulse of what it is that, the people who perhaps earn the lowest incomes in the country, how matters like this can affect them, and perhaps what can actually be done to alleviate the long-term burdens that they feel. In addition to that, I also teach political science at the University of the Bahamas. Um, and I think that's me. I think I've said enough about me. Excited to be here. I'm very excited to be among such a great panel.
Right. Thank you, Keisha. Maybe let's have Therese Turner-Jones next. She's an economist.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm a semi-retired economist, macroeconomist. I worked a number of years at the IMF, and then I went to the Inter-American Development Bank, and most recently, I spent almost 2 years at the Caribbean Development Bank. I've been on the advisory end of sharing with governments my views on fiscal matters most of my career. And VAT is an important part of discussing fiscal matters in any country because, as Rachel mentioned at the beginning, 40% of our revenues come from VAT. So I think it's really important that we understand the whole picture, and that's why I'm here, hoping to shed some light with our audience about why this makes sense or it doesn't make sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Therese. And then next we'll have Don Sargent. He's the Assistant Manager of Domestic Communications in the Ministry of Tourism and Aviation.
Yes. I guess I'll also throw in there. I am also a talk show host of the Guardian Radio 96.9 for the show The Eye Opener, which I think I've been doing now for perhaps 8 or 9 years. And doing that throughout the various administrations and also seeing the changes in value-added tax and having very provocative discussions on it with people calling in has really shed some light onto the varying myriad of perspectives on this issue in terms of cost of living. And I also tend to fancy myself, I guess, a little bit from my educational background, as a bit of a policy analyst and a little bit of political analysis as well, because obviously the cost of living is a political issue and tends to be a hot button issue across the entire planet at the moment, particularly in North America. So I look forward. That's enough about me. I look forward to participating in this panel.
All right. And finally, we have Dr. Leo Roll, who's the CEO of the Bahamas Chamber of Commerce.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, participants and guests. As Rachel mentioned, my name is Dr. Leo Roll. I presently serve as the CEO of the Bahamas Chamber of Commerce and Employers Confederation in my day life. But as you will see, a lot of my students that are actually in the chat tonight, I'm actually also a lecturer. And so this semester, I decided to invite some of the corporate finance and principles of finance students to the discussion just so that they can get a real life experience as to what's happening and see some of what they see in the text coming forth from some of the exciting minds that are on the panel tonight. So we're looking forward to the discussion.
All right, thank you. So we can get started with our first few questions. We're just kind of looking at, an introduction to VAT in the Bahamas. Some of us, like me, don't really have much of a memory as adults of a time before VAT and what things look like from a revenue, from a broad picture standpoint, in terms of revenue, what our budgets look like, things like that. And some of us don't remember buying groceries without VAT added on. So first question, anyone can answer. Why do we feel like VAT had to be, or why do we feel like VAT was introduced in the Bahamas context?
I'm happy to take that
feel,
one, Rachel,
okay.
if you like.
Please.
So for the public, but also Rachel, if you don't recall a pre-VAT world, that's really fascinating. But the Bahamas traditionally has been a very low tax regime. And as our economy has expanded, as the population has grown, as the needs of the population have grown as well, there was a need to balance how much the government's actually spending. So if you look at the expenditure side of the budget with what we actually earn in revenue, why I so love the fact that we're having this conversation today is because in the public domain, there are also lots of questions around healthcare and education. And you heard on Guardian Radio yesterday a very important piece from Dr. Lockhart describing the health situation of the PMH as in dire crisis. So as an IMF, I was at the IMF at the time I was at IDB at the time when VAT was introduced in the Bahamas, but I've been in countries where VAT has been introduced as a way to ease the burden on government. So it's a consumption tax. So every time we spend something, there's a tax levied against our consumption. It's probably the easiest way to raise revenue for any government. Over 176 countries around the world use a VAT. It's easy to administer. It can be broad-based as it is in the Bahamas. Ours is a very broad-based rate. Ours is also very low rate relative to most VATs in this region. So VAT in Jamaica is like 17.5%, in Barbados the same. In some countries, almost as high as 22%. So just to put it in perspective, for the Bahamas in 2015, the need was to close the government deficit, and one way to do that was to introduce a new tax. Remember, we don't have corporate taxes, and we don't have income taxes on personal revenue. So our tax base was super, super narrow, meaning import duties, stamp duties, a couple other little taxes here and there, property taxes, but not really enough and not robust enough just to keep in line with our spending. So I think that was the idea behind the VAT. And that motivation is why we're here tonight, because I think when we start tampering with the VAT, exemptions here, exemptions there, that may not actually result in what it is that you want to do, which is to affect people who need it the most. And Keisha can talk to that population. Then you start to undermine, one, the efficiency of the VAT, the collection of the VAT, confusion in the minds of everybody, including private sector players, who are now wondering, okay, it's 5% off these items today. Is it going to be 5% on other items tomorrow? It tends to undermine the credibility of the tax and tends to undermine the credibility of fiscal policy generally when you start to do these ad hoc changes. So I just want to stop there.
All right. I actually kind of have a follow-up about that. So we spoke about VAT being a very easy tax to administer. It's broad-based. But of course, one of the largest criticisms, I guess, of VAT as a tax is that it is regressive, as any sort of tax like that is. That's why some countries prefer an income tax. I know that some of us know why we're not very big fans of income tax in the Bahamas, but maybe if you could just briefly explain why VAT might have been one of the better models for the Bahamas in particular, as a small country, as a developing country, and as a country that also has a very significant industry to protect in terms of international banking, and where we rely a lot on international investments coming in for our economy.
I think on the menu of options at the time in 2015, personal income taxes on the table, corporate taxes were on the table. But as you say, it conflicted with other sort of businesses that are running fairly successfully on the fact that we are a low tax regime. But remember, this low tax regime has been under threat from OECD countries, from all kinds of organizations thinking it's unfair for whatever reason. Tons of reasons we can document, but I think the VAT was considered to be probably the one that could be sold to the Bahamian public a lot easier than any other kind of tax. And if you look at the most recent reports of the IMF, 2024, as well as this current, the full report is not out yet, but the press release was done after they left in mid-December. Again, on the table, they are recommending a corporate income tax and a personal income tax. So I think Bahamians have to pick their poison. And if we want to be able to have good roads, have good education, have good healthcare, all the things that we care about, have infrastructure that makes sense for our development, then it comes at a cost. And it's like any budget. So you only have $100 to work with this week, but you've got all these other bills to pay. And so you have to think about, okay, am I going to not go to work today and get, cut a day's pay because of whatever reason? And then at the end of the week, I don't have the $100 to pay rent, electricity, transportation, and so on. The government has the same equation that it's working with. Whatever we're taking in, vis-a-vis what we can afford to spend on. And then, of course, their borrowings. And that's the piece that I think worries the investment community if the borrowings become too high. And already at 75% of GDP, we're kind of at a limit that we don't want to really go beyond.
Understood. And so, like you mentioned, the CPSA president who spoke yesterday in a pretty somber interview, and one of the things that she said, you mentioned it, she said you can't expect to have a fancy looking hospital, this top-notch public healthcare system where nobody pays. And I think that that's something that, we can clearly see coming about as a bit of a struggle in terms of governments trying to figure out how to create policy that creates protections and opportunities for people who are most vulnerable while still being able to collect the revenue that's needed to maintain and upkeep these systems that are essential to the countries, these institutions that are essential. And so I think that that's what's come up lately with this decision to slash VAT on uncooked food. So, things that we view as, for the most part, necessities to life in the food stores. And so we saw it reduced from 10% to 5% last year, 5% to 0% this year. So, and then since then, we've had some articles about, does this even make an impact? So maybe if Keisha would want to speak, I know that she sees a lot of people who are struggling day to day with putting food on the table. How do you feel about, how impactful this actually is, first of all? And then I guess we can go into, what it does on a broader scale.
Sure. If I can speak candidly, I was actually quite annoyed by how many times I was asked within the days after that announcement, what impact will this have on the amount of food you can provide? And I'm like, well, you have the same calculator I do on your phone. It'll be a 5% impact, right? There's nothing magical or monumental or miraculous that was going to come out of this, especially since the people, it goes back to the $100 that Therese spoke about, right? About 70% of the clients that we serve at Hands for Hunger are employed, right? They are not unemployed people. They are employed people, right? They earn an income, right? So it's not that they have $0, right? And rely on us for all of their food. No, they rely on us to supplement what it is they can do for themselves, right? So a 5% difference in the groceries that they are able to buy isn't going to make a big enough difference, right? When out of that same $100, we need rent, electricity, transportation to get to the job that they need to get to. So, when we heard it, I think we felt the same thing that I think most people ended up feeling, which was, why are we why are we pretending to do something that in actuality just kind of gives the impression that, I mean, they talk about receiving crumbs off of a table, right? It seemed very much like it was a haphazard decision. Election time is coming up. What is something that we can toss at people that will make them feel like, we are making major structural changes that will have an impact on, the citizens and especially the most vulnerable citizens. And I think what was what was motivating for me, especially as a political science lecturer, was how many of our clients saw straight through it, right? We were nervous for a second that perhaps our clients may feel that that this would make a bigger impact in their lives and perhaps become a little bit more a little bit more cavalier in their spending in other areas, right? Because they thought that this would have a major impact on their food. But it turns out that no, right? Like I said, our clients, the majority of them are working people. They have budgets. They do their best with their budgets. And it was very clear that a 5% decrease in the cost of food really did not do much to help them when the cost of food is extremely high to begin with.
Right, thank you. And we're going to come back to the best ways to maybe provide some relief. But my next question I want to maybe direct to Dr. Roll. We've heard about the benefits of VAT when applied, broadly across the board as being easy to administer, convenient, all these things. So why do we feel that implementation has been so consistent since 2015? We've seen changes in the rate, we've seen increase reduction. Breadbasket item exemptions, flat across the rate 10%, reduction to 5% on some items, and now slashed to 0. And what kind of risks do we see with this inconsistent implementation? I know that I hear often a lot of business owners remarking on how deeply inconvenient it is to constantly have to respond to these changes. So what are you all feeling about?
So, great question, Rachel. And I echo the same sentiments of Therese and Keisha. What we find is that when you think about a disruption to a business, any disruption, whether it be to the bottom line or to a business itself, causes uncertainty, and uncertainty begets volatility. Volatility causes the market to shift. And so, if I'm a business owner, and I always tell, and I'm happy my students are in the room, but I always tell persons when you have a business, if I'm making the same $10 I was making last year, but there are so many other detractors now pulling from that $10. Only one of, I say three things, but it's really four. Only one of three things can happen. One, I may downsize to be able to offset the challenges that my business is having because now you're pulling from the same $10 that I'm making. So I may very well downsize or try to reduce spending in some areas to make sure that there's this happy medium and balance. Or I may very well, it may trigger inflation, which is a systematic increase of the cost of goods and services. What that means then is that I'm going to increase the cost of my goods and services in order to offset all of these detractors that are pulling from my bottom line. The third thing then is going out of business, which really and truly we try to prevent because we don't want businesses, obviously, that are there to make a profit, but also that are there to respond to a need that's in the market. We don't want them to find themselves in situations where they go out of business. And the fourth thing that no one really likes to talk about is going into the informal economy. So I'm no longer on your radar because now I'm completely removed. I don't pay taxes. I don't perhaps have a business license. I probably operate from the back of my vehicle. And so those are aspects that you find. But by and large, the cries that we've heard of businesses, and while I understand that people must understand the chamber has its constituents, just as members of parliament do. Our constituents may be different. While members of parliament speak to and look at the general populace, the chamber's constituents are business owners, those persons who provide that measure of support for individuals. And it has a ripple effect because while a business owner has a business and they are then using that business to help families, think of all of the families that are benefiting from that business. And so when you begin to make changes and you're making those changes in the best interest of your constituents without understanding and looking at the constituents of other organizations like org or like the chamber or even like Hands for Hunger, it becomes a challenge. One of the challenges our businesses face, I remember it so vividly when VAT changed from 10 to 5%. It was absolute chaos because there were some businesses who didn't know which items to change to 5%, who didn't know when to charge the 5 versus when to charge the 10, who had to now reconfigure their systems, because remember, these are systems that were built that was a cost to these businesses. And so now they have to go back to the developer and say, hey, I need you to somehow figure out how you're going to change these particular things to be 5% on the back end. And they had to pay for that. No one came to them and say, well, we know that we're changing the rate. And so here's $5, here's $10 towards the challenges that you would have, because now they have to retrain and retool staff. They have to go through and change the items on their inventory. And think about a large consumer like some of our larger ones who have tons of stores, which is hundreds of inventory they now have to go and manually change. They had to go and change the systems, as we mentioned. And so the system had to be configured. And then again, it came where it was changed to 0%. And so they have to go back again and do all of these things. And again, remember the same $10 I was always making, but more things detracting from it. And it becomes a challenge. One of the other challenges we saw was that some businesses purchased on 10%. So they purchased their inventory, et cetera, on 10%, and now they have to sell it on 5%. And so that offset becomes a challenge because the government, I'm taking a loss because I purchased based on 10%. And yes, you're going to give me a credit, but what we found by and large, speaking with Department of Inland Revenue, is that a lot of times, and this is not an indictment on them, we have a pretty good relationship, but a lot of times the employees at the Department of Inland Revenue really don't understand or know the changes that are happening. And so it becomes a challenge because they're trying to grapple and understand what's happening and then making decisions that impact businesses and impact the livelihood of businesses. And so you find that, how do I do this offset? How do I do this credit? Where do I apply this credit? Businesses, did we give them enough lead time to be able to sell the inventory that they perhaps purchased on 10% so that there isn't this disparity between now charging 5% or even zero? So those are some of the challenges we saw with the instability of the changes in VAT, particularly over the past 2 years, though it may definitely benefit some of the other constituents for some of the other organizations.
Thank you. That was a very comprehensive answer. So we appreciate that. You gave a good overview. And this next question, I think I want to maybe direct to Don Sargent because he sees both sides of this. So he works in the Ministry of Tourism. He sees what it's like to work with fiscal constraints, a budget, the budget that we see every June when they debate it in Parliament. And so you see that side of it, but you also host a radio show. You also are interested in policy analysis. You see how this is impacting the everyday Bahamian. So what are your views on VAT as a tax overall in the context where we have significant fiscal restraints. We are trying still to achieve a balanced budget, but we also have immense cost of living pressures.
So I like many of the points made by my colleague from the Chamber of Commerce. I wanted to add, it is remarkable how similar the challenges we face with the prices changing with value-added tax are to the issues we've had historically with customs duties, specifically on car lots or car dealerships. How 1 year the tax cost to import a car would be 65%. A speech is made in the House of Assembly, it's now 45%. Or a speech is made the next year, now it's 10%. But
The
you've already
same day.
purchased this. Yeah, and you've purchased this vehicle at 65%. I pay close attention. I've interviewed folks from different car lots in the past about this and dealerships. It is an immense challenge to businesses for the cost of these things. And oftentimes you'll find because the changes are made like such a whiplash, it's usually not the case that the end consumer who is buying these goods sees the savings immediately. And by the time comes around for you to see the savings, the price changes again because a policy decision has been made. So there's a thing that we have to consider with value-added tax as well as just taxation in general. There is always a lag when you implement a new policy. You will not see the fruits of that labor instantaneously. It'll take months, sometimes years to actually see the true ramifications of that issue. So with value-added tax, it is obvious since it's now such a ginormous part of our budget. It's an essential tax. It is a regressive tax. Persons who make less money spend more of their income in consumption. We also have taxation on fuel in this country. So boats have to bring in all the stuff since we import everything. You need transportation, the cost of refrigerant for these vehicles. All these are factored in. And the taxes for these things also can change every budget cycle. So what I'm getting at is while value-added tax was touted as this thing to help eliminate customs duties and bring some stability in terms of taxation, broaden the tax base for the government of the Bahamas, I am not pointing any fingers at anybody. I'm just saying a consequence of the way that the policies have been carried out is it's having exactly the same effect of going just like this as we've seen with customs duties, which causes more uncertainty. And as my good colleague here brought about, it leads to uncertainty, which eventually and inevitably causes costs to rise. And what ends up happening is when you think prices should be going down, they're going up. And there's various factors that leads into that. And I'm just going to say this one thing. I am a champion for value-added tax being removed off of certain things, specifically medical services, etc. However, I think it has to be I dare say, bipartisan long-term policy achievement, not a ad hoc, we get involved, we can do this to the next. It has to be a bipartisan effort for this to happen.
All right, thank you. So you actually raised some good points to take us into my next question. So you mentioned that, as we spoke about earlier, VAT is a regressive tax. This means that people who have more money to spend, they pay more VAT than people who have less money to spend and they're on a tighter budget. It also means that when you make certain categories completely, you zero rate them or you remove VAT entirely from them, that means that it's very likely that the people who are going to see, in terms of just the bottom line, a number, not a percentage, people who are going to see the most savings from that are also the people who tend to consume the most, who tend to not be the most vulnerable. And so Keisha spoke earlier about how impactful we even believe this to be to the most vulnerable, this bottom line savings. And so my next question, I guess, is, are these exemptions really helping the people who need it the most? Is there a better way that we could maybe provide that relief that doesn't really involve bad exemptions, but maybe more targeted social relief efforts, bringing that in elsewhere? And anyone who feels like they can speak to this, please feel free.
I can start on this because I'm a huge proponent of social safety nets. Many countries around the world have a fairly decent social safety net targeted at the poor, vulnerable, those in the lowest quintiles on our income scales. And all the reasons you just articulated, the regressive nature of the tax, the fact that I'm as a consumer who has maybe more disposable income, if I spend more, I should pay more, right? That's what I can afford to do. But for the people who are actually struggling because whether they're unemployed or whether they have, and there are different ways to structure a social safety net, but it needs to be targeted. And that way, the government doesn't give a blanket subsidy to people who can afford to pay the tax, when really the people you want to affect are those people that Keisha mentions and the people who really can't afford to pay more. That's the real benefit of a social safety net. It needs to be part of our social service menu of tools that social services has to be able to support those who are less vulnerable, more vulnerable in our community. In I want to say mid 20, maybe before VAT, the IDB was working with the government at the time. I don't remember the exact year, but it could be 2012, 2011. So I can't recall which administration it was. But we were working very seriously on the establishment of a social safety net package, something along the lines of, if you're unemployed, if you have X number of children in school, here is a monthly benefit that you would be entitled to. Means tested social safety net, meaning you can't just show up at the door and be able to benefit from this social service because you may not qualify. But we need to do that. Every decent society does this. Unemployment insurance or some social assistance, single-headed households with children. In Jamaica, for example, women who are heads of households and they've got children and they're unemployed, they are targeted for social assistance. There are up to 400,000 people in Jamaica on social assistance. It's a monthly benefit. They get a check every month. I'm not a big fan of giving a check. I'm a big fan of giving them a digital card, like a MasterCard. It improves it removes the stigma that you're on social assistance because you can go with your MasterCard into the supermarket and spend it. It's easy to upload the new benefit every month. It's very low cost to the government to administer such a system. What we need, though, for this is we need good poverty data. We need to know from our household budget surveys who's falling behind, how many people. Keisha talked about the people coming for an additional meal because they need to fill in a gap. They're working people, but they can't make ends meet. So we need to figure out how to do that, but do it in a way that because it's not the majority of Bahamians that Keisha is serving, right? It's a fraction. It's a small percentage. We seem to think that, everybody in the Bahamas needs food assistance. No, most people in the Bahamas can manage. It's difficult if you're middle class, though, in this country because the cost of living is high. But most people in this country get 3 meals a day. The people Keisha are referring to are people who are finding it increasingly difficult because of inflation. And remember, our inflation is mostly imported inflation. It's not that our government's running up such massive deficits or the central bank is printing money like in some countries. It's because of what's happening outside of our borders that we don't have any control of. We don't have any control of our oil price. Everything comes over the border in a ship. That's transportation costs, that's oil. Everything that's produced in this country, including our access to water, comes from electricity. electricity costs are high in this country because we are still relying on fossil fuels and we still have inefficiencies in that distribution system. So everything cascades. So I'm advocating for a social assistance program that people who need it get it, and the rest of us who can afford to pay for the VAT without those exemptions, although I am also a big fan of zero rating food items and medicines, essential medicines, and maybe a few other things. But I think we ought to not use VAT as a political tool to gain some cheap points, in the run up to an election. But what I really want to advocate here, and I think most Bahamians would agree with me, we need to be able to treat our vulnerable with dignity, and we need to provide the social assistance to them. In economics, we call it a conditional cash transfer. You don't just give them the benefit every month, but you put some conditions. So your kids must show up for school, right? In order to get those lunch feeding programs throughout our schools and the free breakfast, you need to get those kids to school. You have to show up. And there are ways to design that program that, one, you're not only improving their welfare, but over time, you're also building their skills. You can tie into it parenting skills, for example, right? There are lots of ways to use conditional cash transfers to get really good outcome. Lots and lots and lots of empirical studies have been done on this. It's the best way to support people who can't afford even the basics. So that's what I would like to say on that. This is not the way to do it by
Right. May
yeah.
I jump right in on that, Therese, and thank you for that. I agree. All right, I mean the nature of my work, the nature of
Mhm.
my own personal political philosophy. Yes, I am all about the redistribution of wealth, right? But what I think is when I hear you talk about conditional cash transfer, and I agree with it. I'm here with it. But what I think is that I think that that can end up kind of serving in the same way that the ad hoc removal of VAT or decrease in VAT could be, which is just, here's a quick fix. People can be happy if I say this. Let me just say this quick, right? Especially since I think one of our biggest strengths in this country is the fact that we have a relatively small population, right? And I always say, with my work at Hands for Hunger, I believe that food insecurity is a fixable problem, right? We are not dealing with millions of people experiencing famine, right? We are dealing with, like you say, Therese, a small number of people, relatively speaking, who have difficulty making ends meet, right? And I really feel like 5 minutes of deliberation on the topic would go miles toward a solution. But it seems like we never get that 5 minutes of deliberation. What we get is, what is that soundbite I could say on the House floor so that it's in the headline tomorrow? Right. And that's what's frustrating. When you began speaking, Therese, you said things like, oh, we need VAT. We needed to increase the revenue because we want hospitals and we want good education and we want good road. And yes, even after that, we are still wanting those things, right? And org, I have so much respect and admiration for org because they are promoting the idea of public trust and how we need public trust in order for us to do anything, right? So it's everyone is so wary of giving the government more money, not because we don't think that we should contribute to society, but it's because we don't have any faith or any trust that this increase in revenue that you are taking from us is going to actually be used to do any of these things that we would want. Right. So I would say that if we actually saw evidence of the education improving, of the hospitals improving, right, then I think that you would see a major reduction in the amount of people that are knocking on our door for food, right? Because if you have to choose between, maybe insurance coverage, right, because you want to make sure that, you are healthy enough to go to work, like we say, please choose the insurance because we can't help you with insurance, but we could help you with some groceries. So if it comes down to keeping your light on, or getting some food, at least come to us for food while we continue to try to see how we can work on these other things. Right. So I think that conditional cash transfer works really well in countries where they have at least put more effort into some of these underlying issues. And then the cash transfer takes the edge off. Whereas in a situation as dire as the one we have here, it's just going to serve to kind of perpetuate the same issues that we have, which is no amount of money is going to be enough, just because everything is so expensive. And the public structures that we rely on are inadequate, and untrustworthy.
Rachel, if I may add, I'm probably in the middle between Keisha and Therese. One of the things I always caution is a self-inflicted condition and then making yourself a victim. And so I think we have to, while looking at the aspects that will provide a measure of support for those who are truly vulnerable, and then looking at the mechanisms that we have in place where it allows persons to make this choice, as Keisha mentioned, look at instances. So for me, I always think from a business and an accounts mind, right? So my mantra is trust but verify. So yes, I trust that this is a challenge that you're having, but I want to see the data that helps me to paint the picture as to how you got in this position. And while I do want to help, I want to help from the standpoint of kind of educating you first as to how this happened and then providing those steps that allow you to get to the way you need to get to. I always say that, and as Therese spoke, I shook my head so many times because I truly believe in a lot of what she was saying. And while I am too a proponent of reducing the VAT permanently on certain goods, what I also always say to the government and to anyone that I speak to relative from a fiscal standpoint is the government has a fiduciary responsibility to curate an environment that allows for the economy to thrive in such a way that even with the introduction or the increase of taxes, it creates this type of environment where businesses can thrive, they can hire more persons, they can expand, perhaps to family islands. They can, and so if you curate that environment where commerce truly thrives, then the same amount of money that you're getting from the taxes that you're imposing on the backs of Bahamian persons, you will get by virtue of persons now moving. Let's say a business was making 80,000, they're now pushed over into 100,000, and so they're now in a different tax bracket. And so if you begin to look at ways and diversification of the way we look at revenue intake, it allows for the same or even more than you were looking to get from regressive taxes or incrementation or these fees that masquerade themselves, or these taxes, sorry, that masquerade themselves as fees. You'll get that, but you have to first curate that environment that allows for the economy to begin to thrive. And I think that's where we're missing the goalpost, because for us, the easiest and quickest thing to do is to tax, put fees, put sanctions, do fines. And while, yes, that brings you to where you need to get to, if you went the way my grandmother always said, you can catch more flies with honey than vinegar. And so if you went the way of curating that environment that allows for the economy to thrive, you will end up with even the same or even more than you're getting from the way that you're doing it now.
Most definitely. And so in this last set of, and over the responses to that last question, some important issues came up, and it's the connection between fiscal responsibility, transparency, and the public's perception of, a VAT burden or a tax burden. And we are low tax income, but we are also generally, I would say, maybe because of that, because we've been a low tax income in a low tax jurisdiction, Bahamians tend to come off as very tax averse. But Keisha raised an important point. A lot of that stems not from, this delusion about what it takes to maintain systems, but more that there's a lack of trust that the money that, is taken from the average person's pockets in the form of taxes will be used appropriately and to fund the things that we really need. We see it come up all the time when we talk about travel budgets. That's one of the things that, a lot of people have harped on lately. And like I said, Bahamians will still say, where the VAT money gone? Like, they're going to come with that question. And unfortunately, we do not have a lot of legislative protections in place to ensure that the public gets answers. And that's something that I have bothered the good people at org about for a very long time, over and over again, because we always talk about the need for freedom of information, especially, and also it's about the transparency legislation that would provide more confidence to everyone about just the state of governance and our fiscal priorities and how, the things that we entrust to our government are being managed. So, with that said, VAT has been used as kind of a political football, volleyball, I guess, where we see over and over again in political discussions, especially, it spoken of as something that you blame this person for, you blame this person for, and it's a burden, and you all did this, well, you all did this. How do we feel like VAT policy in the Bahamas should be understood in this context? Like, how do we understand it now? What should it be ideally? What
I
should we be working towards, and what's necessary?
if I may, I think one of the first things we have to do is, I don't know who should do this, but collectively change the narrative. VAT was originally sold to the Bahamian people as a means to pay down the national debt. Um, I don't think you have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that the national debt has increased since 2015. Um, our budget has also increased since 2015. What has regularly been happening is we've increased dramatically in some cases revenue to government, but also simultaneously the cost of doing business for government has increased. So the budget increases. The government wants to do new programs, budget regularly outpaces revenue that we see. I don't think that VAT is the be all end all for taxation of the Bahamas. I know historically in the past, when we were a much lower tax jurisdiction, we relied predominantly on the import duties for the government to raise a substantial portion of its revenue. Our population has grown, our needs have grown. We are a country that is permanently seemingly locked in a geopolitical orbit of our wonderful neighbors up north. And that comes with some consequences when it comes to price. There was a time when the Bahamas sought to sign on to the Petro-Caribe agreement to get cheaper fuel. That didn't work out so much. We're seeing now things happening within our sphere as well that are completely out of our control, but the consequences of which we have to face. So I think there's a handful of options that we have. We have, and which is remarkable. If you go back and read the manifestos of some of our political parties way back since the 1980s, you will see the prescriptions for a lot of these solutions. National health insurance, the expansion of which the introduction of a payroll tax would eliminate the government's enormous deficit that we seem to face within healthcare. Uh, Hospitals aren't cheap. Clinics need to be manned. Nurses need to be paid more money. The funds for this, as we can currently see by the trajectory we're on with value added tax, will not be made up by value added tax. There has to be new revenue. But in order to sell this to the Bahamian people, in my opinion, is you sell this as a solution to an ongoing problem. Healthcare in the Bahamas is expensive. Health insurance in the Bahamas is expensive. It's expensive for businesses that try to offer it to their employees, and it's expensive to just regular people who are not or getting their own personal insurance. So, not from national health insurance, the original proposal, which of course the numbers would have changed, things have gone up in terms of costs, would have alleviated some of the burden off of businesses as well as the individual. Persons, if they're still interested, can still get private healthcare insurance, but it's an alternative. So what I'm saying is value-added tax should be standardized at this point in this country. It needs to be a bipartisan effort to make the number whatever the number is. And the only reason it should be tweaked at this point in our development should be if there's a catastrophic event that occurs and the government is in a fiscal bind to do so. It's the same way in the United States and other jurisdictions. Income taxes do not change every year. They change in some cases once a generation because predictability is essential for an economy.
Wow, Don, your points are
Yeah.
spot on. I think the only thing I would add is that there needs to be a level of consistency because, as I mentioned before, when you begin creating volatility in the market, you run the risk of the administrative challenges of this volatility, as I mentioned before, retraining staff, reconfiguring systems, and looking at someone who has to physically go in and rechange those prices. But also, you have tax leakages. If there's a level of inconsistency, it makes it so much easier. I mean, I'll be the fool to say that there aren't some businesses that do things that are nefarious. I mean, there's always a bad apple in every bunch. And so when you begin to create these loopholes, there are businesses that are going to take you for a ride and jump through those loopholes because you created them. And so by being consistent, as Dawn mentioned, some things don't change when you look at other jurisdictions for an entire lifetime. So why then, every time the wind blows or every time we get closer to a season, as Therese mentioned, we begin shifting and trying to, shift and pull things in the way that we want it to go because it looks good from an electorate standpoint. It creates a nightmare administratively, and it creates those loopholes that allows for persons to be able to jump through them. And it also, as Don mentioned, creates a level of investor it diminishes investor confidence. If I'm going to invest in a jurisdiction, I want to be able to predict here's where, because investors don't look at their P&L or look at the benefits that can be derived from this jurisdiction in isolation for that 1 year. They're looking futuristically, and if they can't rightfully make a futuristic judgment or determination as to here's what I can make, here's how I can invest, here's what the return, the ROI will be like, then it becomes a challenge because there's so much fickle nature in the way that the tax system is being administered. And so it creates a level, and we love FDI, foreign direct investment. So why create an environment that is so unstable that it creates or challenges investor confidence? So those are the only points I would add to what Dawn so rightfully said.
Yeah, I love Dawn's intervention. Rachel, let me just, I think Keisha raised it first, this issue of trust. And that has to do with a lack of transparency. But what I would say is that the Bahamas has come a fairly long way. We now have fiscal responsibility law. We have a fiscal council that they haven't reported yet, but we do have a fiscal council. We'd love to hear from them, especially as we're at the mid-year point of the budget cycle. It's time to hear from them. The government probably is preparing its mid-year fiscal report, which I think we're all anxiously waiting to hear whether that surplus is going to materialize or not. But I think you hit on a couple of things. The Freedom of Information Act, super, super important. Remember, the budget there are two sides to the budget. There's the expenditure side, there's the revenue side. We haven't talked about the expenditure side. There've been some, the travel budget seems to be the one that flares up. But I think we also need to hold every single ministry accountable for every penny that they spend and how they spend it. We also need to ask government to be more efficient in how they deliver services. There is no need to walk into a government office and stand on a line to do anything today, right? We are in an internet age, we're in a digital age. We actually in the Bahamas have a digital ID, which is our NIB number. The whole purpose of this was to unlock government services by using that key. And we've sort of we've digitized some things, but we've stopped doing other things. Whereas other countries, it's a no-brainer. You don't need to stand in line to do things anymore. You just go online, you do it, you pay your taxes, you order whatever service you need from the government, you get it done. So there, I think we have to also hold our administrations to account for the expenditure side of the budget, make sure that the capital expenditures are worth the value of the expensive loans that are borrowed to cover capital expenditures, which means we need procurement practices and policies that make sense and that are transparent and that we're getting value for money for every single government contract. So it's not just about taking revenues in, and I agree, we should stop tampering with the VAT. And here's a word to the wise to all of those guys going out there in the election. This is not something you should be playing with as a tool to gain more votes. We want credible policies coming in those manifestos. We want to really understand how this country is going to work for every citizen, how the government's going to be more efficient, how this government can make the business sector work more efficiently, because this is what you hear all the time. Business people are frustrated because there's so many hoops. There's no clarity about when the application is going to get through. And then there are other parts of our economy that we need to focus on. The financial sector. Is it is it working to the best in the best interest of the kinds of growth and the kinds of ways in which Bahamians can have access to capital that can feed into the entrepreneurial side. So those people who are coming to Keisha, the ones who are employed, may also have a little gig on the side. And we know that a lot of people are getting by because they've got a gig on the side. And that's the informal economy. And you don't want that to grow too fast. You want people to be in the tax net for the reasons Don stated, so that when the government needs to do something, the resources are there. But we as taxpayers need to hold our governments to account. And that's why we pay attention to Auditor General reports. I haven't seen one talked about since I've been home, and I've been home almost a year now. But yesterday I got a report from Jamaica where the Auditor General is saying, hold on, those monies that were coming in from Hurricane Melissa, we found some irregularities, because that's what they're for. They're there to do those jobs. And I think we have a lot of tools at our disposal, but we're not using them. And part of OG's mandate is to make sure the civil society, every Bahamian is engaging with our daily life. And that's the only way it changes, is if apathetic voters figure out a way to get themselves to the polls in the next election, right? It's too important. You only have to do this once every 4 years. And in fact, I'm a big proponent of not only fixed dates for elections, but I'm also a proponent of mandatory voting, like they have in some countries. It should be your civic duty, because it's too important to leave to just a small fraction of people to go out and vote. So I think governance is a big piece of this. Trust is a big piece of this. Org has an amazing set of tools on its website to help every Bahamian understand. We've done the budget in simple terms, explain things. People really need to understand what we're up against. And that's the only way change really happens. And I want to say to the public that the Bahamas is not it's a very young democracy. It's been independent for only just over 50 something years. So we've come a long way, but we have a longer way to go to get to where we want to be. But we can only get there if everybody hold hands and do it together. And I wouldn't want to be a policymaker in any environment today because of what Don mentioned about our neighbors up to the north. It's increasingly difficult for them to do a job that makes sense. So I think as Bahamians, we owe it to everybody who puts themselves up for public service to support them, but we also want to hold them to the highest standards. So that's my last 5 cents.
Thank you. And this is just my last question kind of on this trust and transparency segment before we get to our takeaways, and then, we'll be done. And you spoke, like I said, we've been speaking a lot about transparency, what we need to make transparency happen, to the point where it does impact our budget, where we get more efficient spending, where the public trusts where its tax money is going and they don't really mind paying the taxes so much, right? And you have the funds to create that social safety net that you spoke about earlier, because they're not, hemorrhaging elsewhere in areas that maybe aren't so important. And so when it comes to legislation, I think something that we've seen a lot is that we get almost there. The bills get tabled in Parliament, or they might even get passed in Parliament, but then they don't get fully implemented. The office doesn't get staffed. There's no follow through because there are no real consequences for when the law says this, but you just decide you're not going to do it. And a lot of that, I think in a democracy, we expect a lot of consequences to come from the voters, from the public, who say, well, we're going to hold our government accountable. And I think there has been, and there continues to be, a little bit of a disconnect where people are very concerned with issues like cost of living, the things that they live and feel every day, employment, but then they often don't see how it ties into knowing what the government is doing with your money, and how important that is for economic growth, for employment rates to improve, for cost of living, or for a social safety net to exist the way that it should. So with that said, with this latest VAT slash, something that kind of came out of the back and forth about how impactful this is was a newspaper reported that, oh, well, this will only save you however many dollars a month. And the government said, that's not true. What are your numbers like? And, we could have a conversation about the numbers, how they were arrived at. But at the end of the day, when the government was asked, okay, well, how much how much do you all expect it to save Bahamian families? They said, well, we don't know. Basically, not in those exact words. And so it kind of raised my eyebrows, because it's like, this is a big decision to make with no data to support it, nothing to show how impactful it's going to be. So how important is it that and Keisha said earlier that a lot of people did see through this move, or they believe this to be something, done for political expedience more so than a well-meaning, well-informed policy move. But how important is it that we ensure and we demand that there be data, that things can be measured before we make these sorts of decisions, or before we, encourage our government to make these sorts of decisions?
I will just one point, well, several points, but I want to take my hat off of me being a member of the Ministry of Tourism. Not criticizing anybody. One of the things we talk about data that's very important. A while back, I was trying to do a study which I was unable to complete because I was trying to find data from the Ministry of Tourism, not Ministry of Tourism, Ministry of Education on graduation rates. I was trying to find data on BGCSE and BJC results, and I was unable to do so. I'm sure the data exists, and I'm sure I'm going to make the assumption it's not the malicious intent of someone to say we're not publishing this. But the fact that the data isn't available, I can't complete a study. Therefore, now I can't come to anybody can't come to a conclusion to say, well, what direction is education headed in? I know by 2030 we wanted 50% of the population to be graduating from high school, but I can't even track the data of that since 2020 because the data is spotty or just plain simply isn't there. So I just want to say I'm sure the data exists, but it is incumbent upon the public as well to also blow that horn to say, hey, when this PDF XYZ file coming up for XYZ data, when we get the next living wages report, things like that. And I don't want to, I want to stress extremely how important the availability of this data is. There have been times where I've gone to town halls, or the IMF or IDB does a session. I did a session at the University of the Bahamas, and the data they presented was just incorrect. And it's simply because by the time they got done with their study, when the data should have been out, it didn't exist. And so the assumptions they're making and off of writing their reports is off of old faulty data, or in some cases just incorrect. And I don't think it's malicious. It's just reporting of this data is more important than we actually like to give it credit for being.
Huh. I think one of the challenges that we have, Rachel, is that we have far too many persons at the table making decisions who are not necessarily technocrats, and so they don't understand the nuances that go into the changes. A lot of times it is in someone's head, mind you. Someone knows how the shortfall is going to be made up, but it's not adequately or efficiently communicated to those who need to deliver the message. And so you find that you remember that game that you played as children where you pass it on the secret along and you see if it comes to the same thing at the end. That's what I think happens. Bits and pieces of information are shared without understanding that this person needs to have the full gamut. So they need to be at the table every step of the way to understand where we're going. One of the challenges, one of my students asked a question. I mean, obviously, they're not stupid. If you are reducing VAT on some items, that shortfall has to be accounted for somewhere. And so, where are you going to pull it from? And I can guarantee you there are places. This last budget was an absolute nightmare, especially for some particular industries, because there were so many stacked fees. And we see it now with a lot of the persons in the marina and boating industry fighting and trying to understand where did you get these fees from? The real estate, the lawyers, all of these persons looking at the stacked fees, because as Minister Halkitis rightfully said, I mean, yeah, we're going to take a loss here, but we're going to make it up there. Um, and so I just find that there's not a true level of dissemination of the information that needs to be passed. And again, the information or these tactics, and don't get me wrong, I understand strategy completely. So I understand that, yes, there are some instances and some things that you need to do ahead of an election to put yourself in a position to be ready to receive the electorate. But I just think some of the things that we do without the full gamut or the full picture creates a challenge not only for the governing party but also for the electorate and for businesses. I mean, um, I went to the large taxpayer meeting, and the FS touted that X amount of taxes came from this small grouping of businesses. And then he went on to speak about other instances relative to that grouping without understanding that there's only so much you can put on the camel's back before you actually break it. And so I just think that there's this level of dissemination that's not there. And there's perhaps, as you mentioned, Rachel, not a sense, or I think it was Dawn, there's perhaps not a sense of genuine deflection or running away from or hiding from the instances, but in absence of true data, in absence of someone coming to the forefront and say, here's what we are going to do, here's how we are going to do it, here's where the shortfall is going to come from, and here's why it will not be a further burden to you, you leave room for speculation to happen. And as one of the newspapers, Rachel, rightfully did an extrapolation and an assessment, using the information that they had privy to, the only information that was available, you come back and you kind of clap back or you counter that information without any information of your own. And so really and truly, what are you responding to? Because if you are responding, you should say, well, this is incorrect, and here's the facts, and here's how this actually lines up. In the absence of that, you leave the general populace and the public and those who are astute and those who can actually think to extrapolate and make decisions of their own, because you did not substantiate the information that you provided.
So here's the thing, Rachel, on the same point. So when I listen to speeches, it doesn't matter who's giving it, I always look for the piece of data that's informing the discussion. And so often there is none. Now, as Bahamians, we need to break that cycle, as Dr. Roll's saying. Unless the business community holds the statistics office, the central bank, the finance ministry, the Ministry of Tourism with their data, unless we start holding everyone to account, where is the data? Do not come to this meeting without data. Do not issue a policy statement without data. I need to know why you're making that assumption. Please tell us. But Bahamians, and it's not just Bahamians, we live in a region where data-based decision-making is a fairly recent phenomenon, but the cycle has to be broken somewhere, and it only gets broken when people like us in this room talking to other Bahamians to raise awareness of the need for data. Keisha needs to know how many people may walk through the door because she heard last week that somebody laid off 100 people. That means that she knows that she's going to have pressure on her feeding ministry. We need to know exactly which zip code our visitors who are spending the most, where they're coming from in the United States, or which parts of the world we ought to be targeting next to put our promotional budget there. But to do it in the absence of data is just, walking in the dark. Now, I have a lot of respect for the finance officials that we have in this country, and I'd like to say the data exists, but we need it shared. Please share it with us. There is no reason why every month in real time, we shouldn't know the state of revenue for every tax and how much is spent every month. Some countries do that. Inflation data ought to be very soon after the last month, we ought to know what that inflation data is. We need to know when the data is going to come out. We need fixed dates for the data announcements so that, like in other countries, you can plan. Everybody knows when the Fed is going to raise a rate or not raise a rate because it's a pre-announced time frame. But we don't have that culture, and what we need to do is move to that culture. So thank you for raising that piece.
And I just have
Thank
one
you
thing
all.
to say. I agree, but I just want to throw it back and put some responsibility on the media as well, right? Because I don't think it's fair to expect every member of society to know what questions they should be asking. What piece of data would I need in order to make an informed decision? What really is it? And I think that, it's really the media's job to kind of filter that information, communicate with the public in a way that they can understand so they know the questions that they actually do want answers to. They understand the topics that are being discussed.
Most definitely. I think we all have a role to play in kind of remedying the these lapses in communication need and what is realistically needed to achieve what we all want to achieve. So we have had a very good and informative session. I'm sure that I could ask a million more questions, and they would be the answers would be interesting. But now I just want to open the floor up for any questions from people in the audience, anyone in the chat who has been listening and maybe wants some more clarity or something, or thought about something that we missed, just anything that you're curious about. All right. So the only thing that I saw was one question that came in from a Zoom attendee. Dr. Roll kind of already spoke about it. And it was, talking about this discussion about slashing the rate on uncooked food from 5% to 0%. They wanted to know, um, what would be implemented to replace that revenue. I know that there was an answer that was given. It was that, oh, well, we've done so well that we actually don't need that revenue, basically, right? And there'll be economic growth and there'll be spending elsewhere because you don't have to spend so much on VAT on groceries. But if anyone else wants to respond to what the plans are or what you've understood the plans to be there, please feel free.
I just have
I
a
mean, I
comment
think,
on that. Oh, no,
yeah.
go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I think that the whoever asked the question is an appropriate question, because whenever you're going to say, I'm going to lower this, well, okay, so how are you going to pay for it? I mean, that's a normal question. It's the same with a household budget, right? You're going to spend more on having a party this week than you can do something else next week. So there, trade-offs. Um, I think this is where starting to change the mindset of Bahamians when these announcements come is just to ask that question. And I think the public did ask it. And the response was maybe not adequate enough to satisfy everyone that made sense. But I think that's exactly the right question to ask.
I will add that
Don?
it's from one of my students, so that's interesting. Great question, Paige. Go on, Don.
Yeah, no, my it was an answer to the question of trust earlier, which ties into basically the same question. It's a bit of an unorthodox answer. One of the things that I've noticed in law enforcement training in North America, for all of its issues and good parts, is one of the first things that police officers do in a situation is they ask people to show their hands, hands, let me see your hands. If you want to engender trust of the public, I don't care what's coming out of this. I want to see what these are doing. That's where data comes in. That's why I want to see these reports every once in a while. Give a classic example. The University of the Bahamas, my alma mater as well, is a public institution. I know there's audited financials, and the university is seeking accreditation. I'm proud of my university for that. But can I see the financials? Can I see where the funds are going? All public institutions. Can I dig the financials and see, well, which companies are these contracts supposedly going to? Not that there's anything sinister going on. The whole purpose of you doing this is it makes me trust what it is that you do. Why you invest in companies like AMD, Nvidia, Microsoft, Apple, is because they have audited financials. I can see the breakdowns of their companies. I can see the contracts of different companies they have relationships with. I could project into the future. Well, if they have this contract just signed with this company for AI, it's likely the growth will be this. My stock may go up by this much. I can make projections about it. In the absence of that, it's darkness. And in darkness, I try to do this. And if I am trying to do that, to feel the walls around me, and I get the sense as a member of the public now that the government is also feeling the walls around them. I don't trust anything. And the key that we rarely seldom talk about when we talk about even this institution of capitalism that we practice is trust is 100% the product. The dollar is not backed by anything except for trust in it. And I'm just saying, I can't stress this enough. Building trust with the payment people is a lot easier than we think it is. All it requires you to do is to show me the paper, show me the report, show me your hands to see what it is you're doing with the money that you get.
Great, thank you. And we have another question from Facebook, and it's how can we pressure the administration, our governments, to be more accountable? That's a
I think as Don just said, by asking the questions, always asking the questions. And I like Keisha's point about the role the media can play, because I think sometimes the media um, gets information, uh, it doesn't analyze it sufficiently robustly, in my opinion. And sometimes it's just reported like a description. So if the central bank produces their quarterly report, I can tell you that verbatim chunks of that report gets slapped into the newspaper. There is no analysis of it's all an up and down, as we call elevator type analysis. It's up and down. But why is it up and down? So give me some, share with me why this is going in this particular direction. So I think just asking the questions and working through your community groups, talking about these issues, talking about them with your colleagues at work, um, just raising awareness, going and looking for the information yourself, not relying on third parties to help you make a decision. Like Dawn is saying, if you want to find out, the results in the schools, go to the Ministry of Education's website. If that doesn't work, you call up the Director of Education. Where's the data? Can I have it? Why can't I have it? The importance of the Freedom of Information Act is that we have the legislation, but the legislation has not been put into effect because there's no staffing, there's no budget, there's nothing to administer the Freedom of Information Act. So it's sort of like the Integrity Commission. Unless those offices are actually staffed, there's nothing much we can do. So I think asking the questions, and making, if we had a culture where we had more public consultations with our representatives, apart from silly season, then we could also be asking these questions all the time. But we know that these opportunities only come every so often. So I think just asking the questions.
all right. Thank you. We have some more questions coming in, but sadly, we are almost half an hour over time. So I think we're gonna have to end this now. But I will say a lot of these questions are about accountability, what we can do, what we can all do, and this is a big part of org's work. They focus a lot on educating the public, doing all they can to put the information out there. Um, we have the news, not everyone reads the news. And so this kind of has to happen in other ways as well. You kind of need to put information in people's faces sometimes to make them understand that this is important, even if it doesn't sound important, even if it sounds fluffy. Long names for these bills that we say we need, like we need you all to pay attention. And that's the only way that things get better for all of us. And so I would direct everyone to org's website, to their social media, and follow what they do, share what they do, support as best as you can, because they really are doing a lot of work on that front. And so I just want to say thank you to everyone, and then I'll hand everything over to Ari.
All right. Thank you, everyone. That was an incredible discussion. I just want to say a special thanks to Rachel for hosting and to all of the panelists for joining us here. There were a lot of key takeaways this evening, but a lot of what I was hearing too was around public trust and around freedom of information. And even the question just now about how do we kind of put pressure on the government. The answer really is that org has created so many tools and resources that are free and available on our website for you to do this. We have the Freedom of Information Resource Hub that you can find at orgbahamas.com/FOIA. We also have studied public trust. We've gone into communities here and on the Family Islands to look at how and why people are feeling the way that they do toward government, toward civil society and nonprofit organizations, and even to each other. So a lot of this information is available on our website. And so I would really say, governance is a two-way street. Yes, we do need to hold our leaders accountable, but we also need to make sure that we have accurate and correct information, that we're educating ourselves so that we can actually get involved in some of the solutions. Org is really doing a lot to solve a lot of these long-standing issues, and sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect because it's not like solving the issue of hunger. If you're hungry, you go and eat. But a lot of this is systemic reform, systemic change. And so realistically at org, what we say is get informed and get involved. And that's really, I feel like, the answer to that question. And you can find all of our resources at orgbahamas.com. And I'd also just like to plug in that, we are heading into a very special year, special season. We do have a voter education program that we are still looking for partners on. So if you're interested in disseminating some of our resources, please come on, you can message me, let me know. And if you're a voter getting ready to make a big decision in this next election, we have free nonpartisan information to help you get involved in that process. And so again, I just want to say thank you all so much for joining us. I hope that you're walking away feeling a bit more empowered to have discussions around VAT. And I hope that you all will join us again on another webinar, or if you see us out in the community. I also just want to, before we close out, put our position paper on VAT in the chat so that you can have a look at it if you want a little bit more information. And my email is ari@orgbahamas.com. That's ARI@orgbahamas.com. I would love to discuss all of this information with you. So thank you again to our panelists and to our hosts and to you, the audience, for joining us tonight. I hope you all have a good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Great work, Rachel.
Great work.
you.
Yes, I enjoyed it.
I
Thank
was
you,
very
everyone.
nervous.
No, you did a
Rachel, you did
fantastic
an
job.
amazing job. Thank you so, so much. And you
Bye.
all did an amazing job.